continued public support for the maintenance of these laws, suggesting that greater public education and discourse around freedoms of religion and speech will be needed to move political leaders closer to the repeal of such laws. As Kirsten explained, we also looked at hate speech laws, which are somewhat less problematic for religious freedom, often use language such as incitement to discrimination based on religion, among other identity groups, or religious hatred, and in addition to incitement to violence. The Gambia and Eritrea are both examples of countries with laws that look or could be analyzed as either blasphemy or hate speech laws, which broadly restrict religious discourse and criticism about religion. We found also that laws restricting the media and free press often prohibit hate speech and are open to misuse for political purposes. One example that we mentioned in our report is that of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which maintains a very repressive environment for journalists and media. In particular, in 2014, the government took the severe step of closing a number of radio stations, some under the justification of incitement to hatred and insurrection. And we see that in other countries as well throughout the continent. In some cases, officials are responding to interreligious violence, interethnic tensions, and that is their basis for creating such new laws. They believe that the existing ones that they have cannot address these issues in their countries. And examples of this would be the recent laws put forward in Ethiopia and Nigeria. And while the intentions behind speech laws may include the goal of protecting individuals or reducing interreligious, interethnic conflict and violence, they also can still be easily open for abuse for political purposes, to target opponents, and to violate freedom of expression in other ways. So once again, we recommend that all apostasy and blasphemy laws be repealed. States can maintain hate speech laws that meet international standards, that could potentially get at some of the underlying goals behind blasphemy laws, but ultimately, even if not enforced in full or in part, blasphemy laws left in place are open to use and abuse in the future. We further recommend Congress support House Resolution 512, calling for the global repeal of apostasy, blasphemy, and heresy laws. Among the recommendations in our report, we suggest that the U.S. government provide funding and other support to programs that engage civil society to counter hate speech through counter hate speech, discrimination, and violence based on identity through non-legislative means. Religious leaders, peace-building organizations, journalists, and other civil society actors are quite often engaged in creative ways to counter hate and shift culture and discourse towards more mutual respect and understanding. In addition to supporting civil society, we recommend that the U.S. increase partnerships with African states. They can conduct workshops with officials on responsive government practice, inclusive approaches to minority community needs, and foster deeper discussions on the impacts of speech restrictions on freedom of religion or belief. So we're happy to answer any questions you have about these examples or others, and I'll turn it over to Mike Dobbin.
Sure, thank you so much. Thanks for convening this, and my apologies for the Metro that's conspired against me. But it's wonderful to join this conversation. I'm with Search for Common Ground. We're one of the world's largest conflict resolution organizations. We produce about 43 million, we reach about 43 million radio and TV viewers across the world. There's about 400 hours of original programs each month. And so these issues are very near and dear to us, and we work across the continent. That said, my perspective is my own and informed by my experience with the organization, but not the official position. I think as we look at the issues of hate speech, blasphemy, and apostasy, particularly in societies that are experiencing high levels of violence and accentuated conflict, I think there are sort of three major points that we sort of, where we approach this. And we work in Nigeria, in Sudan, in Central African Republic, Congo, and a number of the other societies listed in the report. And the first is that as much as speech is about sort of the institutions, it's also about the social norms that determine what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. What you can say, what's expected and accepted, what you can say in a society without fear of reprisal, not only from the state, from your neighbor, from the armed group, from the other elements in society. And to the extent that there are a few topics that are as central to the human experience as faith, it shapes how we live, how we die, our communities, and how we see our world structure around us. And so there are few strings that are as forceful to pull in a time of political competition in electoral processes or in armed conflict, where those are unfolding, and to pull on the strings of faith and to turn every issue, no matter how base or material, into a question of faith. You've seen that in Central African Republic, in Nigeria, and in a vast number of other places. The second is, it's no surprise in Africa, is here, that it's easier to disagree with one another than ever before. It's easier to incite than ever before. At the same time, as technology has exploded, we're sort of simultaneously coming together and falling apart as a world, and that's particularly true in many societies in Africa. If you consider a 6-year-old woman in the Central African Republic, she was born at a time when she'd be lucky to have a radio, and the only thing she could listen to was the state broadcaster run by the colonial masters, or perhaps a faith-based station where those existed. And from that, at the time of birth, to an age of WhatsApp, the norms have moved very quickly in societies, even as much as our own society is struggling on how to deal with hate speech, with incitement, with what's acceptable and not in the social media and in public discourse. It's even more so in the case in Africa, on a continent where in 1965 there were barely more than 500,000 televisions on the entire continent. So the norms have shifted quickly in societies as everywhere are struggling to catch up. And we see that robust public conversation as we're having here in Africa as well. Afrobarometer surveyed about 45,000 Africans across 34 societies on the role of the governments in regulating religious speech. 49% believe strongly or somewhat that there should be absolute freedom of religion and no government interference. 47% believe the exact opposite. That governments had a right and responsibility to monitor speech that they consider dangerous, to forbid with varying degrees of infringement. And those are numbers that are common across every African country and across every faith tradition, from Catholics to Muslims to Mormons to Quakers to Voodoo practitioners and Benin. There's not one tradition or one country where there's not at least 10% of the population would like to see greater restriction on religious practice, religious speech in the name of security. And that sets up a false choice in countries where there are very real questions of challenges of security. And to cite sort of an example that I'm sort of personally most familiar with, and an alternative model is in the Central African Republic. April last year, a UN operation against a Muslim criminal organization turned badly. A number of people were killed in April. In May, there was an attack on a prominent Christian church in the capital, Catholic Church. 15 people were killed, including a priest. Immediately after, 22 Muslims were killed in revenge. The violence escalated quickly. In the next month, 15 people were killed a day for every day in the following month, and in the months afterwards, people died in not only sort of in tragic but also graphic ways, burnings, beheadings, in a way that was designed to inflict maximum psychological harm as well as bodily harm. And in that context, we got an email to search at sfcg.org, or general sort of contact us on the webpage, from the media regulators of the Central African Republic, who had seen an uptick in hate speech as this violence had unfolded, and they were wondering what to do with it. They'd been censoring stations, they'd been taking radios off air, but with only 34 stations in the country, you start taking them off air, you have very little that remains. And so they were looking for alternatives. And so they reached out to us. We reached out actually to USAID and their human rights mechanism. And we worked with the media regulators to bring in the faith communities, to bring in victims advocates, to bring in victims including sort of the psychologists who've been working with rape victims on what is hate speech, bring in media, bring in journalists, to have a conversation on this is the fundamental problem, and no one knows how to deal with this in our country, but how do we set up a media regulation, and how do we, not only a regulation, but a practice that reduces hate speech, but is also training journalists and helping people understand what is and what's not acceptable. The online sector is exploding. Even my own phone was sort of exploding with pictures of various horrific true or false crimes being committed. And it was a new sector, so we brought in the youth, brought in the 10 bloggers in the country to talk about what should be the norms in the online space, and through a collective and multi-stakeholder process that involved government, regulators, media, faith communities, victims, young people, new media, really crafted out a different sense of what are the sort of shared rules of the game on how we handle this. How, if you're a radio DJ or host and you open up the phone lines, and a woman calls in because her son was beheaded, and she wants to express some very deep and truly felt sentiment about who she thinks is responsible, what she thinks should happen to those responsible. How do you handle that as a radio host? What's acceptable, what's not acceptable for you as the host on the radio station to do, and how do you know if you stepped over the line? So we work with them, and it's been a really remarkable experience. This year, at mid-year, there were only 5 cases of hate speech at mid-year, down from 30 the year before. We had about a quarter of the defamation cases that there were last year. And that's not just us, we do evaluate our projects, but also the independent media organizations that sort of monitor the other NGOs say that there's been sort of a market improvement in the situation. And I think, I think there may be 5 lessons that I sort of draw from that, and that I think are appropriate for U.S. policy and could use some congressional follow-up and action. The first is, as we look at the U.S. support to institutions in this space, whether that's government institutions, media institutions, journalism schools, and things like that, the value is not, the aim of sort of these regulations and of these institutions is about how we structure, how we disagree